All right, well, this is week 3 update for fall semester. So glad you're watching and going along with us. To just give you a rundown of what we covered this week in my interfaith leadership class, we spent a lot of time defining some terms, like, understanding religious diversity is when there's lots of different religions in the same community, or a lot of different people in the same area that have different religious views. That's religious diversity. But a concept that's important to interfaith leadership is religious pluralism. So religious pluralism gets into the idea of how can people from different religions, I should say, work together, basically to on a common good. So pluralism would be the idea of getting several religions together to help combat, poverty, or help clean up a park, or help with civic responsibilities, or something in the community, stuff like that. That would be pluralism. So pluralism isn't diversity. Pluralism is the activity of bringing diverse groups together for a common good, basically. So that's a term you'll probably hear me say as we go through the rest of this semester. I think it'll be a common one that we use. We in my American religious history, the Mormonism and early American history class, we spent a lot of time this week actually talking about how some of the people were responding to this idea of the Second Great Awakening. As we talked about last week, how in the frontier areas were just burgeoning with Protestantism, kind of a Pentecostal type ideas, these camp meetings, things like that. It started to spread. People were wanting to change how they thought about religion. So separation of church and state became important. We talked about last week, and then people started turning to the Bible for authority instead of going to their priest for authority, which is a big change on Catholicism versus Protestantism. Protestants believed more in the authority of the Bible itself, whereas Catholicism was more about you go to your priest and do what your priest says. Also with that authority too, because of they focus more on your personal experience. So what was your religious experience as you read the Bible, as you studied it and did things for yourself? So coming to know Christ yourself was an important component of that. It was really cool because we talked about people who are seeking divine inspiration in their life. We mentioned several stories of people that lived in the early 1800s who had questions about their own salvation. And so they would study the scriptures and learn some things from the scriptures, but then they all felt like, I need to go pray and ask God for this as well, to get a manifestation or some kind of a confirmation of where my state of salvation is, my relationship with God. So they did. And some of them had more emotional experiences, like feelings of peace and happiness and warmth inside, and good, like the Spirit was working on them inside. Some of them felt like they had dreams where they were seeing visions of things. One guy said it was like a whirlwind picked him up and took him to heaven in a dream. And in that dream, he saw the throne of God and Jesus and everybody there, angels and stuff. And this is around the same time that Joseph Smith Jr. is having his experience also, what we call the first vision. He had questions about his own beliefs and ideas and his own state of salvation. And James 1:5 is what he read in the Bible, and then went out to pray and ask God about his forgiveness of his sins and those kinds of things. And that's when he experienced his first vision account. We did spend some time talking about the different variations of the first vision account. So there's an 1832 version, which is probably the earliest version we have. I think there's one that's earlier than 1832 that was recently discovered, but I could be wrong. But 1832 was the first version that we looked at least. And it's interesting because in the 1832 version of the first vision, it was more personal, and it wasn't, it didn't give like a ton of detail. It was more like, here's what it meant to Joseph, but he didn't quite come out and say everything. It was kind of high level a little bit. And some of the students speculated in our discussion that maybe that was because he was a little self-conscious about it, because when he had his first vision experience, he told people and he got made fun of for it and got told that it was false, it was of the devil, it was bad. But yet other people are having visions and they're not getting that same treatment. So he probably was a little more reserved in his 1832 version when he came out with that. But it's the only one, if I remember right, that was written in Joseph Smith's hand. Basically, he's the one that wrote that. That was in his journal. There's one that he did in 1835 that we talked about in there as well. And that one was, he was having he was writing in his journal about the conversation he had with a gentleman. I think Joseph related this conversation to someone else who then wrote this experience down for Joseph, because it's not in Joseph's handwriting. It's in somebody else's handwriting. I don't remember the guy's name off the top of my head. If you know it, put it in the comments. So Joseph has a conversation with this older gentleman that's Jewish. And so Joseph, when he tells his story of the first vision to this Jewish man, he tends to emphasize angels and the contrast of good and evil, with Satan in there attacking him and those kinds of things. He didn't just see God, but he saw angels as well around and things like that. So in the 1835 version, it does come across more with themes that could be relatable for somebody who knows Judaism, basically. So it probably made more sense to him, because he emphasized things that this guy would understand and connect with more. We did the other version that we did was 1839 version. I think it was around like 1839 was the other version, and that's the one that's more the official version. It's more fleshed out. Joseph Smith did that one in response to a lot of basically fake news that was out there about him and the first vision in the church. So he decided we need to put a kind of an official version of this together, and so he did that one. That's the one that's predominantly published by the church, is the official version of the first vision. So it's a little more well-rounded, complete in what it says, which is fine to have that, And then, of course, we have the Wentworth letter, which was 1841 or 1842, right around there. So the Wentworth letter is a letter. Wentworth is the last name of the gentleman who was the editor of the Chicago Democrat, which is a newspaper in Chicago. He had a friend that was Mr. Barstow, I want to say. Mr. Barstow was putting together a history of Illinois, and he knew that Mr. Wentworth had some connections, had some messages with Joseph Smith, and so he said, hey, will you reach out to Joseph Smith and ask him to put together a kind of a condensed history of the experience of Mormons in Illinois, so we can incorporate this into our history of Illinois. So and a little bit about the beliefs of the church. And so Joseph wrote kind of condensed version of his first vision and other things that happened with the saints in Illinois. In that letter, the reason this letter is so popular, famous, is in that letter is where we get the 13 Articles of Faith as well. That was part of that letter. But Joseph did put a condensed version of his first vision in there. It's very high level, pretty quick and easy to go through. So again, probably for brevity and space sake, he didn't go into as much detail as in the other versions. So, which is fine. Some people argue and complain that it's bad that Joseph had different versions out there, and like, oh, he must have lied, or he must not have been telling the truth because he's giving different facts and stuff. No, it's not that way at all. Okay, if you're going to complain about Joseph Smith having some of the different details different in his first visions, then you might as well just cut Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John out of your New Testament, because it's the same thing. They're telling the story of Christ from different perspectives. Yes, they have different facts. Yes, they have some different things. There are some parables in Matthew that aren't in the other ones. There's stories in Mark or Luke or John that aren't in the other ones. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to have the story told from different perspectives. So that's all it really comes down to with the first vision. Now, for my master's level class, the book that we were reading is Carlo Ginzburg's The Cheese and the Worms. Hopefully, the text isn't reversed for you, but it might be. This was a really interesting book to read. So, to give you a quick synopsis of the book itself, this book is about a man named, his nickname is Minocchio, basically with an M. He was a miller, so he helped to mill wood and do things he had a shop basically where he could cut things down and do stuff like that for everybody else. He was a farmer as well. He rented out 2 fields, so he had a pretty good sized farm that he was working. He has done a lot of different jobs and roles in his life. He was mayor of his town at one point. He's ran the books for the local church. He's done a few other things like that as well. He did learn how to read and write, which was somewhat rare for some of these people back then. He lived during the 1500s. So where he lived in northern Italy, just above, I believe, Venice, is where his little town was located. So he was basically part of the Holy Roman Empire. So the challenge for him is he learned how to read and write, which isn't the challenge. The problem is he started talking to people who had different views than the church did. At the time that he was there, the Reformation was in full swing, moving around, and the Counter-Reformation was in full swing as well. So when the Reformation first started, the Catholic Church tried to ignore it and just hope it went away, and it didn't. It basically flourished and did well. So they created a counter-reformation to try to revitalize the Catholic Church. And part of that was getting rid of heretical tales and stories and things inside the church. And because Minocchio was reading books that were some were heretical, some were not heretical books, but they had different varying opinions and ideas. And so he took these ideas from these books and he related them to things he understood. So the reason the story is called The Cheese and the Worms is because Minocchio is trying to understand creation, the beginning of Genesis, basically. And in his mind, he relates creation to the formation of cheese. You've got milk, you stir it up, and then you wait, and you stir it up again, and wait, stir it up again. You get the curds in there, build it up, you get this cheese. And then the cheese eventually, if you set it out, will go bad, and then worms form on it because of flies and maggots, things, and they come out of the cheese. So he thought the universe was this chaos, kind of an ethereal chaos, and then out of it comes the actual universe itself, physical elements, which is the cheese forms out of the chaos, basically, and then worms come out of that, and those are angels and humans and things. And so that was his cosmogony, basically, of understanding how the cosmos came together. Which is why they use that for the name of the book, because it's kind of a unique perspective that this guy gives on it. Well, the challenge is Minocchio gets turned in by the local priest to the Inquisition. Now, this is not a Spanish Inquisition. This is a Roman Inquisition. So it wasn't quite as onerous, wasn't quite as crazy. Next week, we're going to read a book about the Spanish Inquisition, and you'll start to compare the differences. So they brought him in basically to the Inquisition, and they questioned him, asked him about his beliefs. Where did you get these beliefs? What books did you read? Who did you talk to? Who taught these to you? And so he argued back and forth. It took like 18 months, I think, to get that first Inquisition done. So he was in jail most of that time, and then coming out and being questioned. And then a couple days later, they'd put him in jail for a couple of days, and then they'd go back and do research and look at stuff, and they'd question him again. And this went back and forth for a long time on his trial. And it basically came down to he believed, he read these books, he believed some of these ideas, he pushed back against the church. He thought it was interesting because he thought in one point of the book that if the Pope said that certain principles of the gospel are true, then they should be true and we should obey them, like indulgences and those kinds of things. But then another part of the book, he says that he believes that the Pope and the priests created the scriptures to control peasants. In his day and age, the church had a tendency to own most of the land, most of the major stuff. And so what from a peasant standpoint, the average person would see priests who are fat and happy and peasants who are starving and sick. And so there was a distinction. The elite people, they could pay for the indulgences if you were wealthy. They didn't have to worry about inquisitions and stuff because they just give them some money to the church. The church would look the other way. But for the poor people, they couldn't do that, so they went through the inquisitions and challenges. Minocchio is probably more middle class because of his status, the things he's done. He was probably not an average peasant. He was probably middle class, so in between the peasants and the elite. Um, so it was a really interesting book to read. The author did a phenomenal job on this book. If you want a book to understand what's called micro history, so instead of writing a book about like a whole country, or something like that, this is one story of one person in history. And the author did a really good job of taking what little notes they had in the Inquisition. There's not much out there about Minocchio, but the documents about the Inquisition is what he used, and then he used them to dig deeper to find these books, to find who were these people he had talked to, what were their philosophies and ideas. And so he was able to just kind of work backwards and reconstruct the context around Minocchio's life and what was going on with him, and really put a good book together. Well, so if you're wondering, Minocchio did get let go from the First Inquisition. They basically branded him a heretic. So he had to, they didn't have ankle bracelets back then. So he was confined to his village and the surrounding area. He couldn't leave it without permission from the priest. So he kind of had a parole officer, basically. And he had to wear this vest that went over his clothes that had a big cross on it. And basically, anybody wearing that vest, that's the symbol of somebody who the church deems is a heretic. And so the problem is people wouldn't want to do business with him because he's a heretic. They didn't want to talk to him. And he loves talking with people about his views and ideas. So it made life a little harder for him to do. He had to check in to do his weekly sacraments and the other rites and things that he had to do as a good Catholic. He did them. He lived his life. He had a wife. He had several kids. They all grew up. His wife eventually passed away. I think one of his oldest sons passed away, and a lot of his other kids kind of disowned him after the First Inquisition. When they grew up and got out to where they could go out on their own, they left him and didn't really do much with him. So as he got older, he was already probably somewhere around 50 when the First Inquisition happened, and then the Second Inquisition, he got turned in again. Somebody else turned him in saying, "Hey, this guy's spouting off crazy stuff." So he got turned in again, and so we had to go through a Second Inquisition. So he was probably like 65 around that time. So I mean, in that day and age, he's old. He's up there. But because he didn't have to work with his hands constantly. He could work. He managed other things and did stuff. He lived a little bit longer than just a typical peasant would have. But he went through another Inquisition. They put him in jail for 2 years on the First Inquisition, and then he pled to be let out. So he worked with them to be let out early because he was supposed to be in there for the rest of his life. And after 2 years, he's like, "Look, let me out. I got to go see my family and to take care of them. They're poor because I can't work." So he went to do that, got his wealth back up, to the middle class areas and things, and then he got turned in again. Well, this time when he got turned in, it didn't go so well. He, because he had already been seen as a heretic and branded as a heretic, he was sentenced to death after the Second Inquisition. So he died because of that Inquisition, and that's kind of the end of his life. But it's interesting because his idea of cosmogony, about this cheese and the worms concept, was found by the priests who were doing the Inquisition. They found it interesting that he had that belief. But that's not why they branded him as a heretic and got rid of him, basically. So from a theological standpoint, he somewhat still believed in Catholicism and somewhat didn't. But what it came down to was his views. If more and more people learned his views and got out there, his views would change the status quo of society. Because if the more and more people questioned the church, then that completely disrupts the power structures at the time. So the challenge is, up until almost the 1800s, church and state was the same thing. So if your family was Catholic, you were Catholic. You didn't change that. If the people in your community were Catholic, you were Catholic. You didn't change that. Otherwise, you would be completely ostracized. Church and state was the same thing. So the legal government and the spiritual administration was the same. So they had all the power basically combined. So going against that was very, very dangerous, as the reformers found out. So they had to make Minocchio an example to prevent other people from trying to think on their own and get outside of the beliefs and ideas. So that was the challenge. It wasn't that he was necessarily teaching. Some of his teachings were strange. Like he kind of put God on a humanistic level. He said that the Mother Mary uh, was a harlot, basically. He had some weird views that would have been quite heretical against the church. But if he kept him to himself and didn't say him, didn't try to teach other people about him, they're like, well, just don't say anything about him and you'll be fine. But he loved to talk to people about his ideas. And so the problem is even if his ideas, like the cheese and the worms concept, isn't technically doctrinally incorrect, it's interesting to think about. But if that got out, it would get people to question other things, and then it would disrupt society, the whole power structures. And so that's why he was executed after the second trial. So a really interesting book. This book is one that a lot of historians look to. It's a really, if you want to understand religious history, it's one you want to have in your repertoire. You want to read that one because it's a very, very popular one. How the author wrote it, how he did his research for it, how he put it together is a bit of a standard for a lot of other research and things in history, especially microhistory. So really good book. I hope you've enjoyed these videos. If you have questions about any of the things I've talked about so far, feel free to leave those in the comments and I'll be more than happy to answer those. Another book's coming up next week and more fun stuff to talk about. So we'll see you then.